Hello, welcome to the History of Life and Evolution lecture this is part 3 actually. So here we go. We're going to begin by talking a little bit about some terminology we're going to discuss today. So today's lesson is going to involve the actual process of evolution and how it takes place. So we're going to first define some terms, talk to you about some issues that people have, some ideas they have on evolution that may not be accurate. We're going to discuss all those ideas in this short lecture today. So let's first just define some terms. Evolution, as you know, is change over time. Things evolve, things change over time. That word is used in a very broad manner regarding a lot of things in the English language. We use that word a lot of times in the English language. Now, when we're talking about biological evolution, it's a little different than just things changing over time. It has specific references to what is changing over time. So biological evolution relates to the genetics of a population changing over time, specifically the genetics, the genes, the characteristic that those genes create. It can happen on a big or a small scale. Small, they may call it microevolution. I'm going to define that in a second. It can happen on a large scale, macro. Okay, waving goodbye to someone. It can happen on a large or small scale. Large scale leads to a new species. Small scale leads to heritable changes, inheritable changes within a grouping. So a group of organisms can evolve without changing to another species. Okay, if a whole new species evolves over time, we have a large scale macroevolution. So micro versus macro. So I just defined macro. I told you new species evolve. Your book specifically called macroevolution just evolution, new species forming, but there's more to it than just new species forming. A species, though, by definition, is a group of organisms that can mate and produce offspring that can also have babies or have fertile offspring. So, for example, lions and tigers, they can mate, but they're two different species. Their offspring are not fertile, okay, as a result of that. So that's when if two species can mate and if they can produce offspring and they're not fertile, that means generally the offspring probably had an odd number of chromosomes and was unable to produce babies. The term speciation involves a new species actually forming. So this picture down here shows you a gibbon, orangutan, a chimpanzee, a gorilla, and a human, a man, the skeletons of each. This is not telling you that humans came from these others. It just is showing you that they are related through an evolutionary relationship. So a lot of people have the assumption that humans evolved from apes. Well, we evolved from a common ancestor that we share with apes, is how that works out. So the term speciation means a new species is forming over time. So speciation and macroevolution are similar. Macroevolution means evolution where new species form, so speciation is a part of macroevolution. Speciation is not necessarily part of micro. We'll talk about that in a sec. Microevolution, here's microevolution. Now, this is a change in characteristics within a population. So a population is the same species, all right? So when you have a population, you have a group of the same species. What is this picture showing you? This picture is showing you two moths, peppered moths, a darker colored one and a lighter one. In England, in Kettlewell, England, back during the Industrial Revolution in the late 1800s, they began burning a lot of coal for energy production. Okay, when that happened in England in the 1800s, late 1800s, the Industrial Revolution took place. The environment started to change. Well, how did it change? The environment changed because they were burning so much coal that ash and soot were being released in the air, and that ash and that soot was landing on the trees and in the environment around those factories. And the area, everything was getting darker in color as a result of the Industrial Revolution. And that's because ash and soot was falling on these trees. So before the Industrial Revolution, the environment was lighter in color. And before the Industrial Revolution, you would have noticed a larger number of light-colored moths prevalent in their environment. After the Industrial Revolution, if you were a moth hunter and you went looking for peppered moths, after the Industrial Revolution, Lighter moths were harder to find. This picture is showing you after. If you notice, the bark in the trees is dark. Light moths are easier to see on darker bark, so they are not as camouflaged or hidden in the bark. So birds that eat these moths easily can find lighter moths, and over time, the group lighter moths, that characteristic of lighter moths was harder. You didn't notice it as much in the population. Why? Because a lot of them got eaten. Not all of them, but a lot of them got eaten. And they were eaten because they were easier to find. Well, what happened to the darker moth coloration? You would notice more of the darker moth coloration within the population. So the term I'm going to start using is when you see an occurrence of something happening more, you would say the frequency is increasing, which means the occurrence is increasing. If I say the frequency is decreasing, it means the occurrence of that characteristic is decreasing. So due to the Industrial Revolution, the frequency of light moths decreased as a result of them having a harder time to hide in that darker bark, and they were getting eaten more. They didn't go extinct. Their frequency, their occurrence, or the likelihood of you finding one decreased as a result of the changing darker bark in their environment. Over time, after the Industrial Revolution, darker moths increased in frequency. Why? They were more hidden. They were harder to find. So therefore, that particular variation or characteristic, it increased in frequency. You know, if you were a moth hunter, you would have caught more dark moths because there was just as more of them in nature at that point. You would have had a harder time finding the light ones because a lot of them got eaten. Okay, so microevolution would be a shifting in the frequencies, for example, of certain characteristics within a group. So the occurrence of dark and light moths changed. That is micro, small scale evolution. Evolution, you may hear these terms convergent versus divergent evolution. All right, let's first talk about the term convergent. Convergent means things are they're converging towards one point. Sometimes unrelated species, a mammal, a fish, a reptile, and a bird, okay? All these species, they live in water. And since they live in water, nature, and we're going to talk about nature or the environment dictates which characteristics have a better chance of surviving. So since these organisms, they all live in water, you'll notice that they all have certain characteristics that are similar. They've adapted for life underwater. So evolution, even though they're different species, and even though they're totally different species from each other, they have evolved in a way, they've convergently evolved to have specific characteristics that are similar to each other. Okay? They did not evolve because they needed those characteristics. We're going to talk about all that in a second. They didn't evolve because they wanted to swim better. It doesn't work like that. They didn't evolve because swimming was just the ideal way to be in the water. No. Evolution does not work like that. So convergent evolution took place, and their characteristics have similarities as a result of them living in similar environments. The environment dictated their evolution. They did not choose how they evolved. All right. It's going to make more sense when we finish this lecture. Divergent evolution is where two or more related, okay, but reproductively isolated species become more and more dissimilar. So rheas are found in South America. Emus are found in Australia. You take these two, they have been geographically isolated. They are very similar, large, flightless birds. Okay, very similar, but due to thousands of years of separation, they are now diverging more and more from each other, which means the characteristics that they have are different from each other more and more. Why is that? Because they have been isolated from each other. They live in different environments, different places. So the environment dictates how evolution takes place, not the species or not the organism. It's hard to imagine, but I want to make sure we don't have any misconceptions as a result of what people think evolution is or is not. So these guys, divergent, because now they're reproductively isolated from each other, continents away. These organisms, similar characteristics because they have convergent, they've converged. Evolution has allowed them to converge and have similar characteristics. There's a couple people we're going to talk about. We're going to first talk about Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. Now, Lamarck's ideas are not supported by evidence. Students every year ask me, why do you teach us about Lamarck's ideas if they are not supported by scientific evidence? The reason we learn about Lamarck's ideas, or Lamarckian ideas, you could say, is because most people who do not necessarily believe in evolution or do not have a good background in evolution, their idea of evolution is a Lamarckian idea of evolution. Their idea of evolution is not correct. They were taught evolution incorrectly in a lot of cases. A lot of them learned it at an early age incorrectly. Okay, so by learning about the incorrect way, you will know how to decipher the difference between the correct methods of evolution. All right, so the idea of learning about Lamarck is, if I know what's wrong, I know what is right as a result of knowing what's wrong. So let's talk about Lamarck and his ideas and why they are not accepted and why they are not supported. I got to give the guy some credit, though. He came up with an idea of evolution early on, late 1700s, early 1800s. Early on, he was thinking about evolution. A lot of people were thinking about it at the time. So he came up with an idea. Here's what he said. He said, living things can arise from non-living matter. Okay, all right. That right there. That's interesting. That's hard to imagine, but okay, that's where he began the process. Then he says, simple life forms develop into more complex life forms. Okay, that's not always the case, though. Sometimes simple life forms just stay simple life forms. They don't need to be complex. Another one he came up with, inheritance of acquired traits. Now, if you see the word acquire, your siren should be going off. You should be thinking about Lamarck. What does he mean by this? An acquired trait is something that you develop during your lifetime. Like, let me give you an example. If you work out a lot, your muscles will get bigger and stronger. Okay. If you go out in the sun a lot, your skin will get darker as a result of the effects of your environment. Okay. So if you work out a lot, boom, muscles get bigger. You've acquired muscles. If you go in the sun a lot, your skin gets darker. You've acquired a tan. All right. So these are characteristics that you can develop during an organism's lifetime, but they are not necessarily passed on to their offspring. Okay, so inheritance of acquired traits, Lamarck said, if you acquire it, then you pass it on to your babies. Let me give you an example. So if you acquire a tan, your babies will then in turn be born with a tan. If you develop muscles, your babies will be born with muscles. That doesn't work like that. Okay, in real life, if you can get muscles, your babies will be born with DNA that will also allow them to get muscles if they work out. But if they don't work out, they won't acquire those traits either. If you are tan and then you have a child, your child isn't born with a tan. They have to go out in the sun to get a tan. They need the environment to acquire the trait. Okay, so acquired traits are not passed on to the offspring, but Lamarck believed they are. All right. Here's this picture here. Let me show you what this picture is showing you. This picture, this is a Lamarckian picture. Why is it Lamarckian? Lamarck would have said giraffes originally had shorter necks. Okay. And then Lamarck would have said, hey, by the way, I'm talking about this use and disuse. Lamarck would have said they kept using their necks to reach food that was taller or higher up in the trees. So these giraffes kept using these necks and using their necks and using their muscles. So their necks actually got longer. This is what Lamarck would have said. And then Lamarck would have said their necks got longer and longer because they kept using them. So their necks, they acquired longer necks as a result of using and using and using them. So because they needed to get longer necks, they developed them by using them over and over and over again, and they got longer and longer. So each generation then got a longer neck, and eventually long neck giraffes are there, and they can feed up at tall heights up in the tree, and now long neck giraffes have evolved. This is what Lamarck would have said. That is not accurate. The giraffe story of how giraffes got longer necks or developed or acquired longer necks, that is not true. That cannot happen. It is not accurate. Organisms, species, they do not develop things because they need them. That is not evolution. You may need it, but that doesn't mean you're going to develop it. If you don't develop it, guess what? Your species went extinct or is gone from a particular area. Okay? Lamarck's ideas are not supported by evidence. So if you see the words, you use it, it gets bigger. If you need it, you get it. This is all Lamarckian ideas that are not accurate. Most people's misconceptions about evolution revolve around Lamarck's ideas. All right. So now let's talk about the correct ideas. Charles Darwin, he came a little bit after Lamarck, and Lamarck's ideas and others' ideas probably are not probably, they're the ones that got him thinking. Him, along with another gentleman by the name of Alfred Wallace, they came up with some theories to explain how evolution took place. In case you don't remember what a theory is something that's widely tested. It's accepted because a lot of people all over the world are getting the same data and the same results. So over time, something becomes a theory. Evolution is a theory. It has been tested, and the data and the results keep validating what we believe evolution is. Charles Darwin published a book called The Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection. So this term, natural selection, is an important one. That's a big deal when you're talking about Charles Darwin, all right? It is the main mechanism of evolution. There are other mechanisms of evolution, but this is the main mechanism behind evolution. And let's talk about it. So what did Darwin do? He traveled around on a ship. The HMS Beagle was the name of the ship. He traveled around the world, and his job was, he was called a naturalist. That would have been a scientist of the 1800s. And what did he do? He documented life. So wherever he went on the earth, he documented where he was, he documented what he saw, he even kept specimens, kept samples, and preserved things that he could. But his job was to note life, take notes on what he saw. Here's what he saw. He believed that organisms, species, probably descended from pre-existing species. Well, that makes sense. You make babies, so the babies are the result of the parents. And then he said, hey, things are changing over time. All right. He was not the first to propose this idea. Okay. So there was others that proposed this idea. He just was one of the first to come up with a really good, solid, fundamental, logical explanation as to how it could happen. One of the things, he went to the Galapagos Islands off the coast of South America, and he noticed all these different birds, these different finches. And he believed that they descended from one or a few ancestral birds. So in his mind was like, what's going on? I see a bunch of birds. They're very closely related, but they're different from each other. So why are they different? Why are they all not the same? He noticed species on the mainland from the island. The Galapagos are an island off of the mainland. And he noticed on the mainland that there were similar species, but not the exact same ones on that island. And on that island, he noticed species that were only found on that island and nowhere else on the planet. All right. So if you start thinking logically, an island is geographically isolated by water. It's not so easy to leave that island or enter that island. Once you get there, you're kind of stuck, and then you need to make your life on that island. So this was a geographically isolated island where he noticed a bunch of different species that were not the same as the ones that were on the mainland. Okay, so he called this descent with modification. So the next generations were just a little different than the previous ones. 4 main parts of Darwin's theory. Okay, there's 4 main parts. Number 1, variation. All right, so we're talking within a population, within the same species, they are different. There's variations within a species. All right. Part 2, over reproduction. Organisms in nature make way more babies than can survive. So they produce a lot of babies, because babies is usually when an organism gets eaten or killed. Why babies are not quite as fast, they're not quite as strong, they're not able to take care of themselves yet, they have not matured. So organisms produce a lot of babies because they know some will die and not all will reach a mature age. Okay. Struggle to survival is next. See them, they're competing for that one sand crab. These 2 birds both want that food. Competition exists. There's a struggle for survival. That's what Darwin said. Darwin said organisms, they're trying to get their resources, and they're limited. And because of limited resources, the competition will take place. All right. And finally, number 4, differential reproduction. Well, let's talk about what Darwin would have said about giraffes. All right. Lamarck, the wrong idea. Lamarck would have said their necks got longer because they used them and they developed longer necks. They acquired longer necks. Darwin would have never said that. Darwin would have used differential reproduction to explain it. So let me explain to you. This is how Darwin would explain. Darwin would have said, hey, guess what? There might have been long neck giraffes, medium neck giraffes, and short neck giraffes existing. That's the variation he would have talked about. And he would have said, these giraffes, there's a variation in giraffes. Well, over time, these giraffes, they're struggling to survive because they're trying to compete for food. And then they realize that it's easier to compete for food that's real tall because only some of them have long necks. Not all of them have necks long enough to reach the food that's high up in the tree. Because the ones with long necks were able to reach the food, they had a better ability to survive. And if they had a better ability to survive, the longer neck giraffes had a better ability to reproduce. So differential reproduction means not only do you survive, you have the ability to reproduce. You got to survive long enough to hit the mature age of reproduction. Therefore, over time, the population will start to look like the ones that were able to survive. So what would happen to these ones that have X's on them? They probably died out as a result of not being able to survive long enough to make babies. The ones with long necks survived. So therefore, over time, the population started to look like all of them had long necks, basically because they were the ones that were able to survive from generation to generation and produce offspring. Okay, so Darwin's whole concept is there's differences. Some of those differences, some of those variations are better suited for the environment. Organisms with better suited variations have a better chance to survive. And if they have a better chance to survive, they have a better chance of making offspring or making babies. And then over time, the population starts to look like the survivors. All right. So that's Darwin's main parts of his theory of evolution by natural selection. Nature chooses or selects the best characteristics, basically. And the organisms with those best characteristics, if nature chooses for them, they will survive and make babies. If nature selects against something, then it will start to die down. It's not going to live very long if nature selects against you. Can the environment change? Yes. So nature might select for something one day and select for something else. Let's go back to my peppered moth example. All right, I believe it comes up on the next page. Here's my peppered moth example. This is before the revolution. This is after the Industrial Revolution. Light moths were camouflaged before the Industrial Revolution. After the Industrial Revolution, they were easier to hunt. Before the Industrial Revolution, dark moths were easier to see and were easier to hunt. After the Industrial Revolution, dark moths were harder to see and harder to hunt. So the environment changed its ability to select. Why? Because the environment changed. If the environment changes, the organisms that live in that environment will start to shift and begin changing as a result of their environment selecting against or for particular characteristics. Here's what this is showing you over here. This is a praying mantis. It's an insect. Here's its little tentacles. Here's one of its arms. Here's one of its arms. It's basically camouflaged in this flower. What would Darwin have said? Darwin would have said that praying mantises of different colors existed. The ones that camouflaged themselves better in their environment increased in their frequency. Why? Because they hid. They were able to hide better. All right. Lamarck, the wrong guy, would have said, oh, they needed to change their color, so they figured out a way of changing their color to fit in their environment. They would have acquired the color that they needed. It's not how evolution works. Lamarck is wrong. Darwin would have said, they just happen to exist, and they happen to be the color that matches their environment. And because they happen to exist in that color, they were better able to survive. And if they were better able to survive, Darwin would have said they were better able to reproduce. Over time, the population would begin to look like the survivors. Okay, here's some pictures down here showing you white rabbits in the snow. Well, why are organisms in the snow generally white? Because the darker ones were selected against. They couldn't hide as well. The darker ones were hunted easier, so their frequency dropped as a result of not able to hide. So if you go to the snow, you'll see white animals usually because the darker ones, they're not gone. They're not all dead. Their numbers are just reduced as a result of nature choosing against or selecting against them. Why do birds of prey have good eyesight? Well, that's because if you're a bird and your job is to hunt by looking, birds of prey with bad eyesight were selected against. What does that mean? Well, nature said if you have bad eyesight, you're going to have a hard time finding food. Birds with bad eyes don't live long enough to make babies. They don't even live very long because they can't find food. So nature selected against birds of prey, hunting birds that have bad eyes. So if you notice, all these birds that hunt like that, they all have good vision, great vision. They're trying to hunt small little rodents hidden in brush and shrub, and they can see them from a very long distance. If they can't see, they can't hunt. They're going to die. So that characteristic of being unable to see will never get passed down to their offspring because they won't have offspring if they don't live long enough to make babies. All right. So terms that go with all of this. By the way, according to Darwin, the population evolves, not the individual. According to the biological evolution, a population evolves, not individuals. Lamarck would have said an individual can evolve. That's not accurate, according to biological evolution. What's an adaptation? Well, that is a characteristic or a trait that gives an organism an advantage. So in the beginning, before the industrial evolution, being light-colored was an advantage. That was an adaptation. Then the environment got darker. Being light is not an adaptation when the environment changes. So adaptations can change depending on their environment. Okay, these guys here, this insect here is camouflaged. This praying mantis is camouflaged, so that it is adapted to this environment. It fits well in that environment. It has a great ability to survive. If these flowers that are this pink color are no longer there anymore, well, this praying mantis is no longer hidden, and it won't be able to hunt as well. All right, so it will be selected against if its environment changes. Fitness is a term that has to do with an organism's ability to pass on its genetics to the next generation. Organisms with a high fitness have a high ability to survive. Low fitness, low ability to survive, basically. All right. And adaptations, those characteristics that lead to more fitness, they increase as time passes. You start seeing more organisms that are adapted because they are the ones that survive that particular environment. Natural selection, this is Darwin's idea. What does it mean? Nature or the environment picks or selects the most beneficial traits, and it's selecting who has the best chance of surviving and who has a low chance of surviving. All right. And I already mentioned geographic isolation. Geographic isolation has to do with organisms being separated from each other and therefore unable to mate as a result of separation. When they are separated from each other, this can lead to this thing called speciation. So species can change over time. I believe I repeated it, but here's a picture showing you geographic isolation. Two species of fish that formed when the Isthmus of Panama, it filled in over time, the Panama Canal, that area filled it in. So they were not able to swim across anymore. So now they're separated, and due to geographic isolation, they became different species from each other. All right. So how do species form? It really comes down to isolating a species, taking a population of one and breaking it into two populations and then separating them geographically over thousands or hundreds or thousands or millions. It just depends on the species or what happened. Many different changes can build up. Modern science has added to Darwin's ideas. How do adaptations show up? How do these new characteristics show up? They show up by mutations taking place. So random changes in DNA can lead to new characteristics. If that new characteristic gives you a better chance of surviving, then if it's passed on from generation to the generation, those characteristics can become adaptations. Okay, so how to vary, and this is modern science adding to Darwin. Darwin in the 1800s had no idea what DNA was. They had no idea about genetics. They had no idea about how things are passed on. They did not have any information about that. Modern science has added to to evolution by letting people know that, hey, how do new characteristics evolve? Mutations bring about new characteristics. If those characteristics can be passed on from generation to generation to become part of the population, then evolution can take place and nature will select the best characteristics for survival. Okay, that will end today's lecture.